Okay, I think people are still entering Zoom, but I think it's time for us to begin. Welcome, everyone. My name is Shannon Jackson. I'm Associate Vice Chancellor of the Arts and Design and Hadidi Professor here at UC Berkeley, and it's a privilege to welcome you to A+D Thursdays, our regular noon weekly lecture. After I launched our series last week with some scene setting and discussion, today's noon lecture marks the second public program sponsored by Berkeley Arts Plus Design, the office that I run. Next Monday, A+D Mondays launches. Our evening program begins at 6:30 on February 1st. We hope you can join us for that as well. As many of you know, A+D Thursdays is housed inside a large public course exploring arts and design at Berkeley, a course that we created in order to expose Berkeley students to a range of artistic forms and venues, both on campus and off campus, those that explore forms around the fine arts, performance, film, literature, design, and more. And this particular iteration of the semester is focused in particular on the theme of time-based media art. I've taught this course a few times, and I'm privileged to be its host and also teacher this time. And I have to say that it's always a true privilege to see how many ways students and community together connect the dots amongst a range of creative forms and make those forms relevant to their lives. Before I continue with the welcome, I also want to acknowledge the land on which we stand and on which this gathering stands. I want to acknowledge, in fact, of course, that our campus stands on the ancestral and unceded land of the Ohlone tribe. As we convene on this campus, even if we do so virtually today, we recognize not only the Ohlone history of the land, but also that the Ohlone people are flourishing, diverse population and community that contributes deeply to our campus as well as to the Bay Area more generally. Those of us tuning in for this series or this course understand Berkeley to be a special place, but we know we are not the first to recognize, to settle, and to celebrate this exceptional space that we have the privilege of calling our campus. In fact, this series and the course in past iterations has focused often on the aesthetics and politics of place. Past themes have explored the architecture of life, migration and transformation, as well as the role of public art and belonging. And as I hope you saw from past announcements, this year's theme, focused on time-based media art, is particularly resonant for our current moment. Students and community together are going to be exploring artistic forms, hybrid media-based forms that address distinct social and political issues. The role of the photograph, of the film, of video, and of other screen-based culture will be central to our work. So the screen is an object of study. It is a method of study for us this semester. And of course, it is the delivery system for this course all throughout the next 14 weeks. Our exploration this semester is indebted to the fact that we have received a generous donation from the Cramlick Art Foundation. We and all of you thus turning in today are deeply grateful for their generosity and for the Foundation's commitment to research and educational engagement in the field of time-based media art. Let me also anticipate our gratitude for the speakers whom I'm privileged to introduce today. I won't try to repeat biographies that you can read in the online announcement of the event, but I'll start by saying that I think we'd be hard-pressed to put together a more potent trio for helping us explore the politics and aesthetics, the racial histories and global circulation of the time-based image than the crew we have with us today. UK-born, California-based UC Santa Cruz professor Isaac Julian inspires this event as he has inspired so many artists, filmmakers, students, and citizens throughout the world throughout his storied career. Julian is known for poetically rendered excavations of decolonial figures such as Langston Hughes and Frantz Fanon, as well as his multi-channel video installations on urgent themes from global capital to migration to the circulation of neoliberal economies. Mohau Modisakeng joins him in dialogue today, a Soweto-born, South African-based artist whose video installations and hybrid portraits reposition what we thought we knew about the legacies of the transatlantic slave trade, about apartheid, and about what it means to craft a world together on a planet in need of decided repair. Moderating this dialogue, we are privileged to welcome Rhonda Pagnozzi, currently an assistant curator at the Oakland Museum of California, who has included Modisakeng in her forthcoming exhibition, co-curated exhibition with Essence Harden on Mothership, Voyage to Afrofuturism. Rhonda is going to be leading these two in a dialogue for about 50 minutes to an hour. We will be monitoring your questions in the Q&A and the chat before turning it over to formal Q&A to all of you in the last half an hour. Working together as a community with these three leading us, I know that we'll be taken on a special voyage around themes that are urgent for all of us now. Issues and themes such as memory, migration, and social justice, the role of screen-based culture as a principle of connection and disconnection in our world right now, as well as the necessity of reconceiving the histories we tell and the futures we imagine with the lens and perspective of and the commitment to an intersectional, equitable, Afrofuturist world. So I know you all are on mute, but I hope you can join me silently and in the chat, welcoming and offering the heartiest of welcomes to these three for what we're about to hear. Rhonda, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Shannon, for that generous introduction. And thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this amazing series. And thank you to Isaac and Mohau for agreeing to share your time with us. I'm so honored to be in the company of such esteemed artists and humbled by it. And I'm grateful that Mohau has allowed OMCA to display his piece Passage in our upcoming show, Mothership, Voyage into Afrofuturism. And I'm also thrilled that I had the opportunity to see Lessons of the Hour before the McEvoy had to shut their doors down because of COVID restrictions. So we have a wonderful presentation prepared for you. So I'd like to just dive right in so that we have time for Q&A at the end. And so we're gonna start with some footage of Isaac's and Mohau's work first. We're gonna start with a clip from Isaac's piece, Western Union Small Boats. And then we're gonna move into a clip from Mohau from his work, Zion Procession. Thank you, Paris. That was great. I feel the second one was a little bit slower, so I think we got the gist of it, but it was sort of lagging a little on the screen. But I just want to acknowledge that so that the audience understands that about the piece. But as you'll see, they're both. We get a sense of how beautiful and how we can see how both Isaac and Mohau use performance to examine themes around migration and how migration lives in the body and its relationship to place. So in Western Union Small Boats, which was the first shorter clip that we saw, and then in Zion Procession, as well as Isaac's Passage, which we'll see later in the slideshow, but in all of these pieces, the physical body is, in a sense, performing the diaspora. And in these performances, they enact migration as they explore transnational connections rooted in the inequities of globalization, forced displacement, racial segregation, violence, and trauma that lives both in the body as well as in the place. And in Western Union, the first piece, the bodies, which we'll see images of later, they interact with the architectural space and they sort of look like they're flailing like fish out of water. And in Zion Procession, there's other clips of that piece as well that we'll see in the slideshow. And the bodies are sort of they connect to the space in sort of a liberatory, open-ended movements that are sort of continuously trying to settle. Also, I want to remark that there's a spiritual quality to both of these pieces and in this body of work, and these performances, in the way that they enact sort of passages and journeys throughout spiritual realms. And Mohau has also said of his work that he sees himself as a custodian of his family's indigenous healing practices that revolve around the body being in sync with ancestral spirits through ritual performance. So with that, I'd like to ask you both to talk about how you understand the diasporic experience to live in the body and also in the place. And also, how do you determine which places that you'll explore with performance? I'm curious about that. And also, if you feel comfortable, how do these decisions relate to your own experiences of home and sense of place and spiritual journeys? So we're going to begin with Mohau.
Thank you for the introduction, Shannon and Rhonda. I've been thinking about the question of migration and how it figures in my own story. And looking into history, one discovers that migration does not start in 1652 when the first European arrives in South Africa. But in most cases, the history of South Africa is thought of as beginning or coinciding with colonial settlement. But from the 4th century, there's a history already of African people moving from the northern part of the continent, making their way down to the south. And when these northerners arrive in the south, they find the Khoisan, or the Khoi and the San people who are indigenous to Southern Africa. And there's an intermingling culturally and in other ways. There's intermarrying as well between different tribes like the Xhosas and the Batswana. But this history is often erased by the arrival of a man called Jan van Riebeeck in 1652 in Cape Town. This happens after a Portuguese navigator became the first European to travel around the southernmost tip of Africa, thus opening an era of navigation and maritime conquest, I guess, with Europeans now having an easier access to the Indian Ocean. So Jan van Riebeeck is sent to Cape Town by the Dutch East Indian Company, which was based in the Netherlands, but it functioned across most oceans. And also, I think New York is founded by the same company, or the Dutch West Indies Company. So this colonial history of migration starts to take place or take root in the Cape Colony, as Jan van Riebeeck sets up this. It was meant to start as a refreshment station for all these ships passing in the Cape of Good Hope. But it grows into a colony as the Europeans encroach on the indigenous land of the Khoi and the San people. And as they go, they seize their livestock as well. So now you find the landless people that are not able to fend for themselves economically, and they become susceptible to a life of servitude under the slave system that was taking hold in the Cape. And as the Dutch colony has more access or gains more access to these lands, there's a huge demand for labor. And because the VOC, as it was known, or the Dutch East Indian Company, was already in the business of ferrying commodities back and forth across the oceans, there was already an existing supply of enslaved Africans that could be brought to the Cape to work in these plantations. So that's the genesis of colonial settlement in South Africa. And that sets off a number of different migrations, or a series of migrations that are continuing to this day. So I'm a result of one of these migrations, because my parents, my mother and father came from, my mother came from the Free State, and my father came from the Northwest, and they arrived in Johannesburg seeking work. And like everybody else that was in Johannesburg, they were coming from elsewhere, and they had to settle in Soweto, or we ended up settling in Soweto. So most of my talk will touch a little bit on the historical context, because I feel like not much is known about the history of South Africa. There's the superficial stuff, there's Mandela, there's the 94 elections, but this history goes back a long way. But yeah, so my parents arrive in Soweto, and they find themselves there. And I am born in 1986 during a state of emergency in South Africa. And hopefully part of what I will talk about will sort of give a clearer sense. And this state of emergency goes on until it starts in '84 and ends in the early 90s. And I am born in '86 into the space. So as I'm waking up, my eyes opening to the world, I find myself in a place of unrest, in a place where there's a lot of chaos, a space of violence. And at the time, I didn't quite understand what that was about. But as I grow older and I go through high school, I start to read up a little bit more about the events that shaped South Africa. And then Soweto plays a particular role because in 1976, there's a student uprising where Black youth decided that they didn't want to be taught in Afrikaans anymore. Afrikaans is a Dutch-derived language that was used it was the language basically for the government at the time, but it belongs to a minority group in South Africa that comes from the Dutch lineage. But the students then understood that there's something powerful in language and how it can shape your mind and how it can be a tool of your own indoctrination. So they decided that they're going to form this protest. It happened on the 16th of June, where students left their homes, probably left their book bags, and they were not planning to spend the day in class. They met and they gathered and they started moving to different places. And they were confronted by the apartheid police who were very brutal in their response. And the result was that 700 people died on the day. But this was a significant moment in the political organization of Black people. Because after this, the 76 uprising, a lot of people started leaving South Africa, crossing the borders of South Africa, most of them for the first time, going into other parts of the of the African continent, where the ANC had set up bases to train young cadres. But some of those people left seeking education and started going to different parts of the world. So now that's one of the many examples of this kind of migrancy that happens. But Soweto, how does it come about? I was raised in a place called Meadowlands. Meadowlands comes about in the 1950s as a result of something called the Group Areas Act, a law called the Group Areas Act, which formalized the racial segregation of different parts of South Africa. But Sophia Town, there's a place that was called Sophia Town, also known as the Little Harlem of Johannesburg. This was because this place was multicultural and multiracial in a space where segregation was taking hold. So it was an anomaly in the apartheid society at the time. So in 1955, the government sent bulldozers to go level this place down and resettle the people that were there to what can only be thought of as like these labor reserves. So Meadowlands came about. So the people that came from Sophia Town ended up being in Meadowlands, where I was born and raised. Sophia Town is significant culturally or in the history of South Africa because a lot of icons came from that place. So it was an eclectic place where you found a mix of authors, of journalists, of artists, musicians, and political thinkers, all gathered in one space in the same way that I would imagine Harlem was like, as the Black Mecca of people of the migration from the South, but also with the Harlem Renaissance and all the kind of work, the work and reflection that came out of that space. So since Sophia Town is such an important anchor in the memory of the migrations of Black people, I wanted to make reference to it in an artwork, and I wanted to sort of create a performance that responded to this kind of history of migrancy. And in 2017, I got a chance to propose a work for the Performer Biennale. And I wanted to deal with these themes of race, place, and migrancy. But I didn't just want to keep it to the South African context. I wanted to find a way that I could cross-pollinate these ideas into the American context. And I guess, unfortunately, it was very easy for me to be able to make those connections between the experience of Black people in South Africa and the experience of Black people in America, with the history of slavery being so prevalent in the American society, in the American story. So I looked into, of course, there's the Middle Passage, which is this initial migration to this new world, but there's also a series of migrations that happen in that space where people are being sold off, people are being traded, but mainly due to people trying to flee bondage, moving from the south, going up to the north. So I read up a little bit about the Underground Railroad and what significance that plays in this story. So I liked the idea that along the route, as an enslaved person escaping from the south, you would be guided along this path where there would be places of refuge that you could go to as you are making your way up north. So that kind of migration was interesting, and it also shows up in the kind of symbolism that is used around the slave experience in America, where certain lessons in the Bible are co-opted into this kind of new agenda of being free. And we have figures like Harriet Tubman, who comes up and is known as Moses. So there's a biblical reference to the Israelites in Egypt and the idea of exile and the idea of seeking freedom. So I wanted to make that kind of reference. And hence the work is titled Zion. But the term Zion also is borrowed from some of the details that came out of the research that I did. The AME, Mother Zion, is a church that is significant in the story. It was one of the places of refuge in the Underground Railroad. And I found it interesting as a way of anchoring this kind of story of fugitivity in the church. So the performance was structured as a processional performance that was anchored by 3 locations, but mainly there's 2 that are significant to the story. There's 2 that are significant to the story. There's the AME Mother Zion, and there's also the Central Park, where this procession moved to. Central Park is significant because of Zion, or because of a place called Seneca. Seneca Village has pretty much the same story as Sophia Town, even though it happens across different contexts and across different times as well. But I'll elaborate a little bit more about Seneca and that history. But basically, this is my intro into how my body relates to my own story of migrancy, but then how my story is a reflection of many voyages that were happening since the 4th century, but also more significantly through or since colonial settlement. So I think I'll stop there for now, Rhonda. I can elaborate further if needed.
Great, thank you so much, Mohau. That's a fantastic way to get us grounded. And then I know that we will have time to, can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, I know we'll have time later to touch more on Zion Procession as we move through the show, the slideshow, but I'd like to hand it over to Isaac now to talk a little bit more about his reflections on migration, the body, and performance and place. Thank you.
Sure, thank you so much. It's a great pleasure, Rhonda. Thank you for your question, and it's a great honor to be able to be doing this conversation with Mohau and to start this whole exciting course off that Shannon's curated. So in relationship to Western Union small boats, which is a clip you've just seen, the question of migration, of course, is something where I'm thinking about it as a sort of beginning for a journey which has been part of a diasporic experience. Of course, here we have an image from Cast No Shadow, which is the image which begins at the beginning of Western Union Small Boats, which could also be, you know, the beginning of the journey of slaves symbolically from Gore Island in Africa. So there's a kind of pun here in relationship to this image, Cast No Shadow, the gates, this kind of a kind of emblematic image of this diasporian site, so to speak. If we go to the next slide, please. And here we have the scene. Western Union Small Boats was actually shot in Sicily, and in Agidento you have this amazing kind of volcanic hill, and in the film we have this sort of beginning of what I'm calling the Flight for Other Destinies performance. If we go to the next image, please. And this image here is performed by a dance troupe, which I collaborated with, Russell Elephant, who is a choreographer. And what my argument was visually was how to rearticulate these journeys of migration, which had taken place in the Mediterranean. We're of course very familiarized with this journey in terms of the news, in terms of the ways in which, if you like, the dominant discourse is about the migration that took place in the Mediterranean, in Europe, which produced a kind of existential crisis and a political crisis for European culture, and the way in which the proximity between Europe and Africa was being broken by people desiring to cross into Europe, which is what ostensibly Western Union Small Boats is about. If we go to the next slide, please. So, and if we go to the next slide, we can see this kind of performance, which is a way of articulating this journey as a site of rupture, and in a way to explain or to expose the ways in which lands and borders are being transgressed through this choreography of dance and performance, which was a way of trying to instill a more, if you like, poetic response to these debates. If you go to the next slide, please. So this is an image from the performance, Cast No Shadow, which was a blurring of different disciplines between both the projected image and the performance, where there's a sort of subliminal third space that gets created that explores these very important geographical questions which have such huge political ramifications in our cultures, both in Europe and elsewhere. If we go to the next slide, please. So here we have the bodies which are entangled within this net as a kind of metaphor for the entanglement that we find ourselves in the diaspora. And of course, the ways in which bodies become part of this entanglement in terms of how can we as subjects believe in relationship between lands and borders at a time when technology and digital space has been central to the making and unmaking of identity. If we go to the next slide, please. So in other words, there's a way in which the new technologies and the way we celebrate those, both imagistically and also in terms of the way that we are in an everyday correlation to these, produce the knowledge that these are other spaces where other people can go. But of course, we know that the promise of this lure of the image, we go to the next image, please, is really one which has fatal consequences for certain types of bodies, certain types of populations, and those populations which come from the South, from Africa, or North Africa, or South Africa even, to the West. And so, if you go to the next slide, please. So this just shows you an installation of how the free screen work is installed and will be shown at the Cantor Center at Stanford University of part of an exhibition called When Home Won't Let You Stay, which is an exhibition which explores these questions of migration in contemporary art practice, which Western Union Small Boats would be shown as part of. If you go to the next slide, please. So my idea was really to kind of, in a way, also within the performance, to have the idea that actually in the future, it could only not be just Black bodies, but actually white bodies could be part of this process. And in a sense, you could say it was with this moment where we had in Europe the crises of both Syrian and refugees from parts of Europe that were trying to navigate these Mediterranean spaces of the ocean when that became part of a global attention. I made this work in 2007. If you go to the next slide, please. But of course, by only a couple of years ago, would it become part of a whole attention for a global significance? So I think this question of the way in which the politics of hospitality have become, if you like, a challenge of the West in its authoritative manner, that it kind of punishes these subjects, are part of why I felt I needed to bring attention to this question in Western Union Small Boats. If you go to the next slide, please. So in this work, it's the idea of using choreography as a language to act as a sort of way of re-articulating this journey through the body, through architectural spaces, which are deemed actually for certain types of people, but are actually they only come about really through the labor which the West had gained from Africa and other spaces in terms of capital that acquired this sense of architectural modernity. So there's an underlying argument in relationship to architecture. We go to the next slide, please. In relationship to bodies. Next slide, please. And the way in which that movement can be rearticulated through performance. Next slide, please. And so this question of the diaspora, of thinking about the gaze, or thinking about wandering, is also part of a work called Western Union Small Boats and True North, which is this image here where this question of diaspora, of movement, of who has access to spaces is called into question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Isaac. Thank you so much, Isaac. That was really great. It was so great to see those stills, and it makes me want to see the whole piece again. Now I'd like to turn the conversation to looking at your use of form and how, as you already touched on, the how it relates to history and the gaze. I find there's this inherent tension in both of your practices, and as you both touched on already, you explore themes of migration, fragmentation, and the disruption caused by global histories of empire and colonialism as it relates to contemporary planetary struggles for liberation and settlement. So to me, it's natural that this tension would be embroiled into the form of your work. You both draw from multiple disciplines in your practices to mirror the complexities of the topics that you tackle. For instance, in Lessons of the Hour, you use nonlinear techniques, the collapsing of time, the panoramic aesthetic that you use complicates the single-minded, narrow perspectives of history. And in Passage, which we'll see a little bit of later, the boats are standing upright, confronting the viewer and leaving us no room to escape. And these reenactments, this sort of staging of history, provides the audience with new interior terrains from which to draw. And I'd also like to just point out that all of the rich symbolism, the costumes and the heavy textures and the music and your amazing use of sound and even the sea all become their own characters within this visually and sonically lush scenes where the audience is transported on these journeys. Your work is often immersive and gripping, creating environments in which the accumulation of senses manipulate the time and space. And I find these hypnotic techniques to create spaces of meditation to meditate on the socio-political context in which they're engaged. So I'd like to ask the question first by mentioning a quote by Frederick Douglass, that the point from which a thing is viewed is of some importance. And so questions of gaze, who is the audience, who's pointing the camera or the cell phone, and the means of production continue to inform our discourse of truth and justice. So I'd love if you could talk about your practices in relationship to perspective and ideology, and also how do you choose which techniques and form and symbolism and media to best serve those ideas? We'll start with Isaac.
Okay, sure. So then maybe if we go to the image from True North again, that'd be wonderful. Because in this work, there's a way in which the question of the gaze is very much centrally located in terms of the story of True North, which is ostensibly a retracing of Matthew Henson's steps. Matthew Henson was an Arctic explorer who went to North Pole with Perry. So Perry, in 1909, found the North Pole, but he did this at the aid of a lot of help from Matthew Henson, who was an African-American explorer. And what I did was, in this work, is to turn the gaze around by focusing on an argument which ensured when they actually got to the let's call it True North, or the North Pole. And this was an argument about who got there first. And this resulted in Perry disowning Matthew Henson, and in a sense, Matthew Henson becoming completely unknown. And so in an existential sense, it was very much about, if we go to the next slide, please. It was very much about getting this narrative, which I actually found out through an amazing book by Lisa Bloom called Gender on Ice, which is a book which was exploring the idea of women explorers, for example. A book, way beyond its time in terms of ecology and art. But for me, it was very inspiring to read this book. And so I took this idea of gender on ice and made Vanessa Murray become the protagonist of this work. And it was her gaze, so to speak, and the rereading of this history which enabled the work to be made, with this existential quest around the relationship between the Black subject in a white void, in a Fanonian sense. If you go to the next slide, please. And this question of ecology, of the way in which sort of also the melting of ice, the kind of questions of geology and the ecological questions, was something which was also a kind of, if you like, second theme in the work, in its more poetic rendition. If you go to the next slide, please. And so in a sense, Western Union Small Boats and, if you like, True North are both works which are looking at this question of the rupture within the way in which the gaze can be returned and can become a place of a kind of radical refusal of the ways in which, histories are written from particular perspectives. We go to the next slide, please. And of course, this question of space and land, of who has the ownership of that space, in this question of pleasure, or in terms of the kind of oceanic, is something which is also at work in both pieces, between frozen ice and the kind of mercurial dangers of the sea. Next slide, please. And this question of who's looking, of property, of the ownership of the space, of land, is something which is very centrally located in both those works. If you go to the next slide, please. So this question of modernity and how that comes about was also the question of architecture. And so in both works, you know, whether it's the architectural space of the sort of Europe in this manifestation, or if we go to the next slide, please, we can see that this question of this imperial dream is something where in both works, whether it's the imperial dream of reaching the North Pole first, or the imperial dream that migrants may have of this kind of imperial space, it's a question of who belongs to that space and who can have access to it. It's a whole theme in a lot of these works, which I've named the expedition trilogies, which both True North and Western Union are part of. Next slide, please. And so this idea of the rupture of modernity, of the way in which these boats symbolize these journeys, boats which I found in an island just off Sicily, where, if you like, you could say that these journeys were basically found in these discarded boats. That once they were found by the local, they put them into a kind of area where, in the middle of the island, where in Lampedusa, where people couldn't find them, we found them. This work, which is called Sculpture for the New Manaliam, I think symbolizes these kind of journeys and the ruptures in modernity in a physical sense, you know, symbolically, the bodies that undertake this journey and the ways in which they are broken, you know. So I think there's a kind of radical act of trying to use these images as well as the symbolic journeys and bodies. Next slide, please. If you go to the next slide, please. And the next one, please. So with Lessons of the Hour, this question of the gaze is very much connected to the way in which Frederick Douglass views nature and culture. In the beginning of this work, he talks about being in a very young child and looking at a tree and basically saying that the way in which one looks is of great importance. And this question of looking, of the gaze, is something that's very central to the making of the work. And of course, the way in which work is installed here at McEvoy, and also this image here from Metro Pictures, where it was originally installed, is all about questioning how we look and who's looking. If we go to the next slide, please. And so in this kind of assemblage of images, we're able to encounter, if you like, these questions, which are a kind of poetic rendition of these, I think, quests, which are very much part of looking at a history and a culture, particularly when we think about, if you like, the slaves look at the way in which cultures have been formed, which Douglass was, you know, so exemplary in expressing in his autobiography, of which I was able to use some of the texts to, you know, to help make this work, Lessons of the Hour, which is a homage to Douglass, of course. Next slide, please. And I think this is where we come to the questions around multiple screen work and the way in which utilizing multiple screens and film and video installation as an art form becomes its own unique way of rewriting the present by looking at the past, but also by using these forms of, if you like, installation techniques to question the kind of normative ways in which we may think about the role that images may make in trying to really explore these pertinent questions. Next slide, please. And of course, Anna Murray Douglass, Frederick Douglass's wife, was also someone who was very important in terms of being able to both support her husband, but at the same time, be part of the struggle for the liberation of African Americans who were slaves in this particular moment through her work that she did with Douglass, both on his paper, The North Star, but also in her own way, the kind of curatorial skills which she had in terms of making Douglass's clothes, also in terms of her own sort of position as someone who was, in a way, married to a very famous husband who was the most photographed man at that time, because Douglass was very interested in photography. But her portrait was not one which was one that was seen by many people and was not photographed. So in this work, I'm highlighting her presence. Next slide, please. And so in a way, is in this constellation that we're able to try to create a new language, you know, that the way that technology has been able to create this new possibility for viewing and for telling stories and for creating intervention into what I feel is a very important moment historically speaking today that we are in. Questions of civil rights. Need I say all the terrible things which happened recently? It goes without question. If we go to the next slide, please, that there is a real importance in thinking about these questions and the role that these characters, like Helen Pitts, Douglas' second wife, have played in trying to make us look at these questions of civil rights and abolitionist possibilities. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Isaac. That's so rich and so many different ways to think about your work. Now I'd like to hand it over to Mohau, if you could talk a little bit about your techniques and form and symbolism and how you to best serve your ideas around the gaze and history.
I think for in my practice, I deal a little bit with memory as a way of trying to access the history of the past. And in the African context, the history of Black bodies is not well documented. In fact, it's the opposite was happening in that when colonialism took hold in Southern Africa, as in most African countries, there was an effort to erase any evidence of there having been an existing society. So there's when one is dealing with history, there's a lot that has to be pieced together to fill in these gaping holes of history where you can't find evidence of yourself. For me, my form or my interest in form in my practice is informed to a large degree by a kind of sense of erasure. And this erasure comes from the kind of history that has played out in Southern Africa. So in trying to piece together these fragmented markers of my personal history and the history of Black people in South Africa, you have to rely on research, on reading up, and on having conversations with people, sort of engaging the oral history that exists still to this day. But the Zion procession, I'd like to go back to that a little bit. The Zion procession is about visualizing this kind of state of fugitivity that is engendered by people fleeing from slavery. In the South African context, I want to look at more the idea of what home, how does one connect to a sense of home? And in the images that I have in the slides, The first image is showing, it's probably shot somewhere in the 50s, and it's showing images of people in a bus, probably heading home or heading to work. And this happens due to the migrant labor system, which takes hold when diamonds are discovered in South Africa in 1867 or something like that. And this starts a new wave of migration where different people come from different parts of Southern Africa, and they gather in this place called Kimberley, where they are there to offer their labor. Most of these men were sent by their chiefs to go work so that they can buy or earn money to buy cattle, to buy a plow, to pay lobola or dowry. And they would work on these contracts of about 3 to 6 months. But then after working and earning enough for what they needed, they would go back home. This was not reliable for the mining industry at the time. So a system called, or a system of compound labor was started. And people had to now live in these kind of compounds that were created not close to the mining fields, where for the period of your contract, you'd be basically turned into a prisoner, and you'd had to carry these past laws. So now you have a history of incarceration of Black men that removes them from their communities and their families. And the result is the broken Black family. So there's an absence of this male figure in these communities and in these families that I have been trying to piece together through making reference to the details of that history, or making reference to the erasure and the absence of these figures. But this kind of sense of absence, so just imagine a family where a man now suddenly has to leave, go to Johannesburg, and then he disappears for 6 to 12 months. When he comes back, he's a changed person, because in these urban areas or in these compounds, there was a lot of alcohol that was sold, so that the workers are kept in this perpetual state of servitude. So these kinds of experiences, they bring a different person home. So when they come back home, they're different. So even though they might be physically present, they feel distant. As this evolves, the burden of taking care of the family falls on the Black woman, who now has to go to these white cities to go offer her labor as well, and leaves her children behind. And where she is at, like in the image that you're seeing now, there's captions that I'll forward later on if somebody needs. But in this image, you're seeing someone, a Black woman working as a maid or a servant to a white family. And they, most of these laborers who work in these white families and these white societies end up leaving their children behind so that they can take care of white kids in this place that is somehow segregated according to race, but yet they become mothers to these children. So I wanted to investigate how that looks like in the Black family, how this absence looks like in the Black family. So after performing the Zion procession in 2017, in 2018, I wanted to make a work that responds to that performance. And I made a work called, it's titled Zion, but now it's focusing in on the interior evidence of this absence. So in the procession, it's like there's an aesthetic of fugitivity that borrows from the private now suddenly being out in the public, like seeing people out with their furniture and stranded in the public. But in this case, we are looking at, so could you please skip to the image of Zion, the photograph, please? So in this image, I used a table that's sort of a colonial styled table, a Victorian style table, to make reference to the context of the colonial history of South Africa. But I also have coal that is being thrown on the table a dining table where a family would gather and there would be a meal, but there's coal going on the table. This is in reference to the kind of mining industries that sort of engendered this kind of migrant labor system that took people away. So now I think of this as some kind of family portrait where the father is not present and the offsprings are not present. It's just the female figure that is trying to deal with this responsibility of keeping the fire burning, the fire of Black families and of Black communities burning in some way. In the last frame of the series, we have an image of the same woman, but now she's carrying a frail body of a man. This being a reference to the absent father figure or the absent male figure. A lot of my work is very personal, so in some way it is me trying to reconcile my own experiences of trying to piece in these erasures that have happened through history. So my understanding of form comes from chasing the details that would come from the research that I'd be doing, and then sort of distilling that into images or symbolism that sort of makes reference to the themes that I'm dealing with. Yeah, so I think I'll leave it there for now, Rhonda.
Thank you, Mohau. That's great. In fact, you already led into our next question, which is we're going to look into how you both have integrated intersectional feminism in your work. And I think you were able to touch on some of that there. So we have about probably another like 10 minutes around to wrap this up and then to move into Q&A. I want to make sure we have enough time for questions. So maybe we'll just round out with Isaac, if you could talk a little bit about your thoughts and processes and motivations to center women in the pieces that we've talked about, but also just your work in general.
Sure, yes, thanks, Rhonda. Well, I think if we are able to think about these questions in a more dialectical manner, there's a way in which historically, at least in my own work, I've been involved in sort of thinking about these questions for quite some time. So in a sense, you know, even Frederick Douglass, the representations of Anna Murray Douglas and Helen Pitts, in a sense, emblematically represent thinking about these questions of the position of women in Douglass's own work. And so if we go on to the next slide, you know, this question exists very much in relationship to thinking about the Richardsons, for example. You can't quite see it because it's an installation view, but the Richardson sisters, who are represented in the work, are the people who actually campaigned for Douglass's freedom, of course, along with Douglass's own campaign, where he gave hundreds and hundreds of speeches at the time when he was in Scotland, where he lived to escape the kind of success of his book, The Autobiography of a Slave, which he had written. And also he was a fugitive slave, so he didn't want to get enslaved. There was a possibility that could happen, a danger that could happen. But when he lived in Scotland, he returned back to America a free man because the Richardson sisters had actually bought his freedom. So you know, the role of women is really important in Douglass's work as it is in my own work. You know, so if we go to the next slide, please. There's an excerpt which I was going to show of Lessons of the Hour, where, but maybe we can pass that. Let's just go to the next slide, actually, because I saw time is upon us. And if we go to the next slide, please. And if we could go to the next slide. These are just images here where you can see Anna Murray Douglas is foregrounded. If you go to the slide afterwards, please. You'll see there's representation here of Oakland Museum in the green dress behind. His wife, there's a reference to Susan B. Anthony, along with J.P. Ball. These, this is the photographic salon, the reconstruction photographic salon. But questions of gender or interspersed and in a visual intersectional sense, I'm trying to make them organic. If we go to the next slide, please. And if we go to the next slide, please. We've arrived at the slide that I wanted to begin with in this reply to you, Rhonda, which is my first early film, 1986, A Passion of Remembrance. I was in a collective called the Sankofa Film Video Collective. And the Sankofa Film Video Collective was myself and 3 women, Maureen Blackwood, Nadine Marsh-Edwards, and Martina Atele. And we go to the next slide, please. And in this film, The Passion of Remembrance, it's really a work which is about a critique of phallocentrism in the Black Power movement. So my commitment to these questions of gender have been, in a way, formed by being in this collective where I worked in the mid-80s by the making of this film. We go to the next slide, please. And again, this is another image of an installation work which I made called 10,000 Waves. Here you have the image of Maggie Chong. This is a film which completes the Expedition series. It's about the movement of people from China to England, where over 30 Chinese cockle shell pickers died in the north of England due to their lack of knowledge of how the tidal coast worked when they were picking cockle shell for their job. And basically they met a horrid ending, and it was a scandal because of the way in which they had died. And this was very moving for me, the fact that they had died in the ocean and had a kind of relationship to questions of, if you like, the way in which many Black subjects had died in these oceanic spaces. So this work stars Maggie Chong as Mazu, who's a goddess from the 15th century. I went back to the 15th century to really explore the fact that this question of movement has been taking place over thousands of years or hundreds of years. And basically, I was able to make a mythical journey through the representation of Maggie Chong as the Mazu figure that transverses different spaces and times, transverses the screens as they're hung in the atrium of the Museum of Modern Art in this installation view. Next slide, please. And my last film, A Marvelous Entanglement, is a portrait of Lina Babardi, the architect who created Brazilian modernism, Italian originally, and her involvement in architectural movement in Brazil and the work that she did in terms of making astonishing buildings. If you go to the next slide, please. Is the subject of this multiple screen work. And in a sense, this multiple screen work is an exploration of Lina Babardi's incredible legacy as an architect and the ways in which she was able to lead as a woman in relationship to really revolutionizing Brazilian architecture, and her work in museums, along with her relationship, if we go to the next slide, please, with restructuring and making Brazil a much more, I would say, reflective space around the influence of the African Brazilian cultures. So if you go to the next slide, please. And then, of course, there's work like Baltimore, which I think maybe just connects to what your project, Rhonda, the Afrofuturism project, where Baltimore was shot in Baltimore, and it explores questions of Afrofuturism, and also, well, there's a cyborg played by Vanessa on the left, and Melvin Van Peebles on the right, where there's a kind of gaming aspect to exploring the museum and the relationship to cultures and collecting. Next slide, please. yeah, so there you have these questions of gender and technology have been explored in these works. And of course, this is a real preoccupation of my work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both of you. There's so much to talk about. It feels like it's difficult to decide when to stop or to interrupt you both in your flow. And I know
just interrupt me. I talk
okay.
too much.
Okay. Now I know for next time. And Mohau I know he had some more slides he wanted to share, but I think it's a good time for us to move to Q&A now. So if anybody has any questions, I see there's one question. Oh, it was in the Q&A box and it's gone now. Let's see.
I think I can remember it was from Jamandria around sound.
Yeah.
And what the sonic plays in Mohau's work, but we can also thank Isaac. And since we are running out of time, perhaps even connecting that to some of the other formal questions that people have started to ask in the chat around how do you choose between a single channel versus multi-channel? Why performance? How do thoughts that go in when you're producing images as beautiful and exquisite and harrowing as what we saw, say, when we saw Mohau's coal distributed across that white gallery. There's a few questions here about the media and forms that the artists use and how you choose them, or if you might have chosen a different one in some cases and realized you wanted to go in a different direction. I think there's a few ways that people could, a few questions might get answered if you talk a little bit more about form. Sorry to interrupt, but I've been watching.
Mohau, please.
Oh, you're muted, Mohau, you're muted.
So as mentioned before, from my contest, I'm dealing with the history of erasure. So there's a lot that needs to be filled in. And in that kind of space, memory becomes very important. And in my own culture and traditions and spirituality, memory is not something that lives in the past. It lives in the present and it's accessible to us. So there are rituals that one can perform to connect to an energy of something that happened a long time ago. And I come from a family of dreamers. Most of these images would come to me in a dream. I'll just be confronted with an image of water, of a boat, but it's all blurry and I can't quite figure out what it is. And then I'll start having conversations with my mother, who's usually my first point of contact because I gain my spirituality from her. And she would give me some details that I would keep. I would do some reading into the historical context. There would be details such as the Mendian passage. When I started with this work, I didn't have that in mind, but as I'm doing research, I discovered that there's this event that happened, which I knew about, but it was removed from me. But as I go into the details of it, some images start to become a bit more refined, and that informs the form. So hopefully people can get to see the video later on or something. But in one panel, there's a woman who's wearing a military uniform, and she's holding a falcon, a bird that represents some kind of a spiritual connection to ancestral memory. So if people get to watch this, I would like for them to keep this in mind, that this is a gesture of invocation in some way, where this woman is embodying the memory of this man, and she's sending this bird out as a way of trying to communicate with him. But what she's remembering, or what she's reenacting, is the moments that led to the sinking of this ship where over 600 men died. So she puts herself in that position and she reenacts every single thing. So she's marching, or she's doing this marching dance. And that was just a moment of deciding, or the choreography, it would be good to make reference to the marching. But as I read into the details, again, research for me is a big way of trying to unearth these kind of details. in the research, they tell about someone called Isaac Joba, who was who was on this ship as it was sinking, and he made a speech as this ship was going down. And the wording of that poem or that speech has images in it that are sort of made reference to. So the marching that the woman makes in the film is something that he talks about, where he says, we should die like brothers, and we are doing the death drill. And then he goes into this way of sort of keeping everybody calm in this time of peril.
Yeah, that's great. We do have a few questions coming up in the Q&A here that maybe we could address, that I could hand one over to maybe Isaac next. Let's see here. This one's great because it relates to both your work. Isaac, you mentioned Afrofuturism, and Mohau is in the exhibit. And I know Afrofuturism is a word that some people apply to their work and some people don't feel comfortable with, but somebody did ask, Catherine Mezor asked, only if there's time, could each artist address their particular use of Afrofuturism, especially in time in their works? So maybe we can start with Isaac. You can talk a little bit about that.
Yes, I mean, I think this question of Afrofuturism was one which I became very excited about around 2002, 2003, and the making of Baltimore. And so it was also the beginning of what would be the influence of technology and the way in which that might really influence the making of video artworks. So I was approached by an organization called iBeam, which is based in New York, to make some special effects. So the special effects, of course, probably look quite quaint compared to an audience today in terms of the use of new technologies in video artworks. But in a way, the question of gaming and the way in which the protagonists of the work, Vanessa Murray, who played the cyborg, and Melvin Van Peebles, because the work was also very much influenced by a documentary I made called Badass Cinema, the history of Black action films in the 70s. Melvin Van Peebles is the person who made an amazing film called Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song, 6 S's. And he became, I invited him to be the protagonist of the work, but in this work, there's a sort of, what can I say, a bit of a reading of his film. You know, it's not the man gets the girl, it's the girl who, in a way, is able to really become this very enigmatic figure. And her cyborgness is something that remains a kind of mystery within the work. It's also work which looks at collections. The Waters Art Gallery that had an amazing collection of Renaissance works, and the Great Blacks in Wax Museum that had an amazing collection of Black wax works. And I put the two of them together in a kind of seance in the work, with the cyborg figure traversing the spaces, which was a kind of cat and mouse game between Melvin. And all of these things were very much influenced by Octavia Butler's writings, which I came across at that particular time, and the way in which she would have Black female protagonists in her works in the future, and the way in which she was narrating, if you like, almost slave narratives, but also thinking about technology and science fiction, which I thought was really exciting, exhilarating at the time. So it's great to see a whole exhibition now dedicated to this. And I think there's some plans to think about this question in Santa Cruz at the university. Carlton Hester, who's our dean at Danham at the moment, is thinking about making such an exhibition or event. So I think it's in the air, and I'm really excited to see Mohau's work and the exhibition open at Oakland.
Yeah, I thank you. I feel like there is something happening around this term and people adopting it in their own unique ways. And actually, Mohau had some really beautiful things to write when we reached out to him to talk about Afrofuturism. So is there anything you'd like to add about the term and your work in that context, Mohau?
I don't remember what I said.
Oh. Well, I'll let you.
For me, Afrofuturism has been something difficult to access. I think because of its genesis in America and it being adopted in the last decade or so in African practices, especially in studio-based photography, I'm still trying to find an entry into it. I understand the ambitions or objectives of people like Sandra and all of that, but I want to look at it as a way of negating, trying to find grounding in actual physical landscapes or physical context. I feel like it's almost as if the only place where Black bodies or Black histories can evolve without any kind of constraints is out in space, when we are all here and we could figure how things work here. So I think there's a certain admission of defeat in terms of the grounding that memory in Africa. I mean, there's Afrofuturism. Africa is implied in that, but our history as Africans is erased. So I think Afrofuturism should be more about excavating what's under the surface as a way of connecting not only to our futures, but to the past as well. Because like I said, I feel like memory is not in the past, it's ever existent out. It's just a matter of capturing it in some way. So as far as memory and Afrofuturism, I feel like that there's, this would be strange, but there's a spiritual tradition in South Africa of communing with ancestral spirits as a way of foretelling or of prophecy. So that's how I would resolve that question, I think. But I don't remember what I said.
That's about what you said, sort of. I thought it was really beautiful, and you really brought Afrofuturism to the present moment. That felt really resonated with the team and a lot of people who are working in this project. So I think we have time for one more question, maybe. I was gonna let somebody speak up. Camille Critchlow is asking about sound and music in your pieces. Should we go ahead and let Camille ask the question?
Isaac?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think, the relationship between, just a little bit of a backtrack. Interesting enough, I have a student who's based very near South Africa, who's doing a whole Afrofuturism project, but from an African perspective, because there was once a desire for Africans to actually be involved in, astronaut, the whole science of space travel and those kinds of ideas, so I think it's really interesting to find this other counter modernity that's in some of these questions around science fiction, and indeed that there are some African countries who had a desire to participate in some of these aspects. And in some ways that leads in relationship to sound, because Baltimore was actually my first 5.2 surround sound work that I made, or 5.1 surround sound. So that meant that you had a much more sort of, what can I say, a visceral relationship to sound architecturally and its design. And so it's an important piece for that, in that sense, where the architectural aspect of the sound in a sonic sense becomes part of the experience of being able to have a more haptic relationship to the image, where there's a kind of possibility for the audience to participate in what some of my ideas around spectatorship, you could say. So sound's incredibly important, the sonic aspect. And in fact, I wanted to make works which would just be sound-based works. But I think this turn in video art, in time-based media work, became really pivotal in relationship to the sound as well as the image, and the attention paid to that and the installation of it. And so there's a way in which in many works, such as, for example, 10,000 Waves, is a 9.2 surround track sound. That is a whole other area of aesthetics exploration in relationship to thinking about the ways in which we can interpolate people watching and create the idea of mobile spectators, because that's a whole other sort of philosophy in terms of the use of multiple screen works. And a lot of that is engineered by the use of sound and the kind of way in which it can drive the spectator, not perhaps too aggressively, but insinuate the spectator to look in different types of ways.
Yeah, you both are masters with sound, and I love the way sometimes sound actually leads people in and out of the scenes in these really beautiful way in both your work. And maybe just we could round it out more. How you could talk a little bit about your use of sound in Passage. It's so lush.
Yes, in Passage, I worked with a South African artist and composer called Neo Muyanga. And I approached him before the work was made, and I was just giving him some kind of idea of the pictures and what he could meditate on. But his work, I knew that by working with him, he would be able to sort of find the sonic landscape that works with the image. Because there are some of the things some of the symbolism in Passage are present in his own work or his own exploration. So it was easy to make that. So collaboration for me is interesting, where I come with an image and I try to explain it to a person as much as I can, and then they evolve it. But I'm also learning a little bit to play so that I'm able to create soundscapes that connect to the images. But with Zion, the clip that we showed, there's drumming that happens, and there's a lot of stomping that happens, and there are horns in the background that are going, and there are chants. So as the cast is dancing, they are chanting and they're making all these sounds. That entire sonic environment is very similar to what happens in the African context when there are rituals of remembering or connecting to spirits that have come and gone. So music for me works as a way of, it's one of the tools that this memory can be brought to the surface and made palpable.
That's beautiful. Yeah. Well, we have so many questions coming up that we're not going to be able to answer, I guess, because it's 11:30 for you, Mohau, I believe, at night. And this has just been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for all your patience around the technology and us sorting all of this out. It's been so great to participate in this.
And if I may, thank you, Rhonda, for being such an incredible moderator. You're somebody who's been thinking very deeply about Afrofuturism and around also how to create amazing exhibitions around this kind of art. Let's remind ourselves that we are really also anticipating the reopening of OMCA and this exhibition that we hope we'll all get to see, and also that you all could get to see Lessons of the Hour at the McEvoy Foundation for the Arts. I really appreciate everyone's thoughts around Afrofuturism. Some of the students know that last Tuesday, I suggested the possibility that Frederick Douglass was a proto-Afrofuturist, perhaps a cheeky thought, but it's one that was generated by the combination we have had here today. All of you have been so extraordinary helping us think about sound and performance and screen. And we really look forward to being in co-present shared space again, so we can explore these themes and have the types of experiences we know we're meant to have with work from artists like these and curators like you, Rhonda. So I hope everyone can help me thank this crew for offering such an extraordinary lunch hour to all of you. And thank you to Mohau for taking up his evening in South Africa with a conversation with us. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.